Hello and welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we will be discussing how to make drow your big bad evil guys and why it's not done correctly very often. So the first reason why that is, I find, is just because there's a lack of understanding about them. Oftentimes when you see drow in many campaigns, even some of the greats like Matt Mercer's, they're kind of mustache-twirlingly evil because the DM didn't really have a good grasp of the culture of the drow or the lore, or they didn't build them well within their own world. Honestly, even some of the better stories about the drow, like the Drizzt Do'Urden franchise, of which I have read one book for the record, I liked it. I found that it was a better interpretation of the drow, but they still seemed like villains out of He-Man, where, oh no, the slightly scarier monster that we will forget about in one episode because the stakes just are non-existent.
Yes, and I have read probably not all, but quite a few of the Drizzt Do'Urden and other R.A. Salvatore books, so I do have some of a grasp on the material. And speaking of the material, the problem with the drow is a problem with the source material, literally going all the way back to Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, because in Lord of the Rings, the elves were, in the same way that the drow represent sort of He-Man levels of stereotype mustache-twirling villains, the elves represented whatever the opposite extreme of good would be. So when wizards created the sort of perverse mirror of the elves, what was created and what many players see is just the literally the dark to the light. I mean, in the most literal sense, the dark to the light. All of the elves are good, all of the drow are evil, and it takes away any kind of complexity in the race, in the kind of characters you can make.
Yeah, I think the pantheon of gods for the Dark Drow is also named the Dark Saladrin to the Light Saladrin, which is just, congrats guys, very, very original names when you were building your new Dark Empire. And going off of that especially, it's also the fact that these drow, you'd almost think from watching someone run them, that they got up every day and said, I am going to be the most evil person possible, while staring very intently into the mirror. That is not the case of how they are presented in the lore. In the lore, we see that they are quite literally indoctrinated from birth into a specific ideology. Their gods literally promote this philosophy. Lolth, by comparison to many of the other D&D pantheons, has a very direct hand in drow society. And so this isn't just evil in the sense of, oh, I know I'm doing something wrong, like a Sararak. It's not evil in the sense of a Tarask, where it's just devouring worlds. It's evil in the sense of they believe what they are doing is correct because a higher power has literally told them that it is correct. And that's a very different kind of evil, which is very hard to understand for most people because they can't get into this new philosophy or ideology that the drow have. So it's a little bit fair for DMs to mess it up from time to time. But if you're going really deep into the drow campaign, you should at least try to give it that little extra bit of effort.
Now, we should mention that in some of the newer lore, there have been some efforts made to introduce characters like Drizzt Do'Urden, characters like the followers of StellarStrategyGaming, more on her later, who break the sort of stereotype of the drow as being evil. And the newer lore of Forgotten Realms has even introduced whole heretofore unknown drow civilizations that were never under Lolth's sway. But for the drow that we longtime fans know, they live in the Underdark. They live in one of the most hostile environments in all of Faerun. They live in an environment where, with the exception of the Deep Gnomes, who are generally good, almost everything you encounter in the Underdark is trying to kill you. And even something like a dwarf is an evil version of a dwarf. It's like a Dr. Evil kind of, we're going to make dwarves. An evil dwarf? So they're raised in this incredibly hostile environment. One of the things that is covered in the Drizzt Do'Urden novels is part of the reason why they train so intensely in the ways of war isn't just to fight other sentient beings, it's also to take on the various monstrosities of the Underdark. And because they have been isolated from the other races for so long, there's a stereotype of them that they are all evil, so their views that elves will try to kill them on sight or humans will try to kill them on sight are essentially immediately confirmed. What I like to compare it to would be something like the Vikings or the Mongols, where you look at some of the things they did, and yes, it's objectively terrible, but it makes a lot more sense in the context of the lives these people were living and what they were up against in the world that they knew.
Yes, and in fact, the only thing that I can really push back on that with is the argument that they are slavers, but in all fairness to them, every even remotely evil D&D species is a slaver. I think even most of the neutral species in D&D are still slavers, which could be an actually very interesting perspective, because historically many pre-European empires did not have racial-based slavery, so it wasn't quite as bad. But that's still off topic. That is the only thing where even people within their own society could say, okay, this doesn't seem great. But even then, there are creatures like the Quagoths, which they have subjugated, which literally can't function by themselves, so they can still see that as a good thing, which in this dark dimension definitely makes a whole lot more sense.
Yes, and in D&D, slaver is the sort of shorthand for bad guy. I understand it, but they do overdo it. Even the frog people who are like a foot tall or something are slavers somehow.
3 inches.
Whatever. Can we please just drop this trope about? I mean, yeah, slavery and people who take slaves are bad. We've established that we shouldn't need to talk about that anymore. Can we please leave that trope behind in our future fantasy settings?
Yes, and speaking of leaving things behind, the more philosophical section has just passed. To focus on the more mechanical issues at hand, I find that the theming of the drow in both the monster manual and in what we see of them in custom campaigns is kind of underwhelming. The only thing that's very consistent is usually appearance, and even then there's some drift here. And the example I like to use is their poisons and traps and minions, in that the drow are definitely like an espionage civilization. In fact, in the book I've read and in the D&D lore I've seen, we actually don't really see them going to conquer another civilization. It's all subversion from the shadows and things like that. They only throw an army at you if they are already confident they're going to win and just do it as a formality, basically. And I feel like we should definitely be seeing more of that in the game as well. Don't have your drow villain show themselves in the first session. Have a bunch of species that are stereotypically drow slaves show up, because again, that's important to the drow, and unlike most slaving species, it actually does play a role in how they fight as well. So have some Quagoths show up, have something like that go on, where it's clearly the drow is trying to whittle down the party a bit so that it will be confident that it can win later on.
In the R.A. Salvatore book, I believe it was called The Pirate King, it actually does an excellent analysis of how a group of drow mercenaries of Bregan de Eth take over the city of Luskan. And the way they do it is by making allies within the city, and then when they do launch attacks on things, they send like swarms of kobolds and swarms of goblins and other servant races. Nobody really knows they're fighting drow until it's too late. You're not going to get to fight an actual drow until you've gotten through, just as Mara actually just said, a lot of their servants and slaves and mercenaries. And if you're attacking a drow city, a drow compound, anything like that, it's going to be riddled with magical traps and force fields, and then there'll be things where you have to be able to fly or levitate to gain access. It's not a straight up dungeon crawl. Yes.
The next big thing is just driders in general. They're so problematic as how they are used, because every single time I have seen a Drider in Critical Role or in some of RuneSmith and XP to Level 3's videos, they are the bad guys, which does not track because they are social exiles from drow society. And realistically, given what we know of drow society, that actually means they're probably closer to neutral or good as far as their alignment goes. So you should not be having them fight on the side of the drow, especially considering that many of their challenge ratings are actually higher than your average drows. I think the only exception is the drow priestess has a higher challenge rating, meaning that quite literally they are more powerful because they are more good aligned. So they should be helping your party, perhaps be the quest giver looking to redeem himself or get back his humanoid form. There's a lot of different ways you can go with it. Just please get it correct so that there's not this cognitive dissonance about what the lore is for people of us who have read it, or even just a mechanical dissonance of why is this kind of drow different from every other kind of drow.
Yeah, and that's something that's really important to remember when you look at the drow in the Monster Manual and in other source books. Their stats are generally not all that impressive, but keep in mind, drow are always going to have magical items. At the very least, they're going to have +1 swords and things like that. Drow are very proficient magic users. Their houses are highly organized with highly trained wizards and priestesses. So they are definitely going to be enhanced with magic. So even if what you're fighting is just a baseline drow fighter, that guy's going to have magical weaponry, and he may have some additional magical items to help his cause. The deepest enemies of the drow are other drow. Their society can't expand because their population is stable due to constant attrition because of fighting between the houses. Now, you mentioned the Driders specifically. That's a punishment for breaking drow law. Sometimes drivers can be overcome by magical means because the drow are so proficient with magic they can enslave them magically. But in general, yeah, the Driders are going to be hostile. Now, you could have a Drider having been driven mad by what happened to it, and that would make a compelling and interesting and tragic character. But you're absolutely right. They're not generally willingly going to be serving the priestesses of Lolth. In addition, there are other factions within drow society. There are the priestesses of StellarStrategyGaming, who are aligned chaotic good. There are the priests of Veyroon, who are evil but are opposed to Lolth, and are a different kind of evil. They're not quite the same kind of super evil, cartoonish evil. And of course, there's the Order of Drow Paladins, who are Lolthful good.
I hate you.
Anyway, the point is, and even within the priestesses of Lolth, the drow houses all hate each other, so they're always constantly fighting. So if you're at war with House 1, go to House 2 and ask them, would you like me to help take down House 1? There's a good chance they'll accept that offer. This has a lot of potential for a really interesting campaign with a lot of intrigue, a lot of politics. It's for that party who's into it for something deeper than just we're going to steal, murder, or hump everything we encounter. And if you've got those players, then hey, this could be the campaign for them.
Yes, my final thoughts on this before we wrap it up for the day are that with any villain, not just the drow, you just need to make them have internal sense and internal consistency, and you'll be halfway to developing a great villain just from there. You don't even need to get into the lore like we have. I'm going to give an example outside of D&D here. It'll be pretty short, but that is the Lich King from the Adventure Time series. We see him repeatedly throughout the show and even in alternate universe episodes, but he never has powers that we haven't seen before, and he always has the same goals. He doesn't radically change because the plot needs him to or anything like that. I'd argue there's even episodes in there where he might have had to have changed for the episode to make sense, but they still didn't because they wanted to remain loyal to the character, and now he is one of the most terrifying villains in a child's show of all time. With the drow, you can have something very similar. You don't even need to touch on the lore for them. If you can just maintain that sort of vibe that the drow have going, they could be a really scary villain.
Yes, and it is important to remember that the fear of the drow is as much a problem for any potential allies as anything else. A noble dwarf might defend their homeland against literally anything that attacks it, but for them to go out and take on the drow either in the wilds of the Underdark or, heaven forbid, in the drow's own fortresses, that's a whole nother order of bravery. It's well known that the leading cause of death in the Underdark is drowning.
I really dislike you.
As always, we thank you for watching and for putting up with my jokes. Feel free to leave a good D&D dad joke in the comment section. I always appreciate them. So next up, we're going to be doing How to Run a Seafaring Campaign. The book, which will not be named, got it horribly wrong, so we want to talk about how to do it right, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next one.